Thanks for tuning in to the Real Women Chronicles podcast. I am your international certified life coach, Tiaudra Taylor. The sole purpose of this podcast is to get you from where you are now to where you want to be. Yes, it's time to break chains and to get unstuck. Thanks again for joining in. Let's begin. Hello. Thank you guys for joining me again for another Real Women's Chronicles podcast. I am your host, Tiaudra Taylor, and I am excited about this week's podcast. God put it on my soul to talk about from going to broken to blessed. And one of the reasons why this topic is so near and dear to me, because I spent a lot of my early adulthood just feeling broken and being lost. So I think it's important in my podcast to be vulnerable as well. I do believe that a lot of the things that we go through in life is for a particular purpose. And a lot of times that purpose is to help someone else and to not be afraid to be vulnerable and talk about the struggles that you've gone through. So as a coach, I say this all the time. If you watch me online, you'll see me saying it. But I truly believe that you cannot teach further than you learn. You don't necessarily have to go through everything that people go through in order to coach them on it, but you have to learn about it. And I believe that God placed me in certain circumstances and certain relationships so that I can truly come back and teach others and just let them know how I overcame them situations. And you never know how important that is. It was important for me when I was going through my growth process. And still, I believe growing is just an everlasting task for all of us. Life happens to all of us, no matter where you are in life, no matter how close you are with Christ, you're going to go through some life circumstances. You're going to go through some life challenges. And I believe that is why we constantly need God. We constantly need Him in our lives. And it's not a situation where, okay, now we have everything we want and we just have no need for God. I believe it's just meant like that. You will constantly feel that yearning for God to be present in your life and the circumstances that you go through. So not to go off task, but sometimes the Holy Spirit does that to me and I just have to roll with it. But in all, I was, for those who don't know my story, okay, it's important to understand that brokenness is, although the word sounds so harsh and it sounds like, oh my gosh, you're low to the ground. You are kind of low, don't get me wrong. But brokenness and blessed can often go hand in hand, because through your brokenness, you learn so much and you learn things that you can't learn during your sunny days. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to just talk about and be open about is that I went through a 7-year toxic relationship. It was in my 20s. I was about 24 years old when it started, and I was actually in my early 30s when I finally grew enough strength, enough balls, for lack of better words, to really, really love myself and to get out of that situation. And it was toxic, so it was off and on for many years. But for some reason, I could not find the strength to break free from this relationship. And part of that reason is that most times in life, I learned that you honestly don't know what love is until you know what love is not. And I was one of those individuals where I learned what I didn't want out of love before I could appreciate what I did. And the issue with that is whenever you are unsure of what love is, then you don't have the ability to teach anybody how to love you. So you become a breeding ground for people who don't know how to love you. And most of all, probably people who don't know how to love themselves either. Because clearly, if you're in a state of brokenness and you're in toxic situations repeatedly, and you're in situations that make you feel low and less than, and you're holding on to these situations, it's clear that not only do you have a lack of love for yourself, a lack of love that you can't teach to anybody else because you don't have anything to teach, but I personally learned that lack of love, again, breeds people who have the same issues. So it's kind of like the blind leading the blind. You go in this circle with these individuals because you can't really help them and they can't really help you. See, the thing is, whenever you lack self-love, okay, you will attract that which you are. And I say this in previous podcasts. So in my personal experience, it wasn't even that particular person, but it was relationships when we were during our off seasons, like if I like to call it our off seasons, I was still attracting the same type of person, just with a different name and a different face. And eventually, when every situation around you looks the same, the only common denominator is you. And it took me years. Of course, I'm young and I did not realize this until I got in my 30s, but I realized that I was the common denominator. So I couldn't continuously point my finger, at other people and blame them. Oh, this person doesn't know how to treat me and all men are this and all men are that, when it was something in my disposition and the way that I loved myself that attracted these situations to me. So because of that, I can now stand as a grown woman and not feel any anger or resentment towards any of the relationships that I was in. Everything that I went through was because of issues that I had within myself. And I was only responsible for the issues within myself. And I think us women, we often try to fix our issues in somebody else's issues. And it's too much weight to bear. Only God can do things like that. But, of course, only God can do things like that. But the truth is, many people who are broken don't even know it until it's so far gone. Like brokenness is what leads you into that toxic relationship. And it's that thing that causes you to ignore red flags. However, most times we don't even realize we're broken until we actually go through the breakup. And then we realize all the things that we gave up and sacrificed during the relationships. But we don't realize the person who we were going into that relationship. And I know I've had people who said, oh, I was so much stronger and I had my own thing going on. Well, not so much. Most toxic relationships have signs and red flags. And sometimes our desperate need, especially in my case, my desperate need for wanting to be loved and accepted by someone of the opposite sex, led me to ignore a lot of signs and to sacrifice who I was for the sake of love. Because going in the relationship, I was already broken. Going in the relationship, I didn't know that I had these issues. And coming out of the relationship, I not only had the issues that I had going in, but I even had more issues, like trying to heal a broken heart and things like that. So I personally, like I said, I spent 7 years, and 6 of those years, 7 years in a toxic relationship, and 6 of those years, it took about 6 of those years, to actually realize that I was looking for my broken pieces in someone else. Better yet, I was looking back. As I look back, I realized that I may have been looking for healing in someone who wasn't even whole themselves. And matter of fact, I was. It's not even a maybe. So that's another issue that you will run into when you're broken. You will constantly look for other people to provide that piece that, people use the saying that, oh, this is my piece to my missing puzzle. But the problem is it takes 2 whole people to make a healthy relationship. A person shouldn't come into my life to make me feel whole. I should feel whole within myself. And listen, it takes time, trial, and error for some of us to realize that. But there's no one person out here that should be coming into your life and completing you. When I met my husband, I had established wholeness. So I knew that whether or not he knew how to treat me, whether or not we last, long in this relationship when we initially met, I knew that I would be okay because I knew that I was okay within myself. And again, it takes time to get there. But once I got there, I started attracting a different type of man. And ultimately, I attracted a great man, my husband, who I love dearly. But it didn't happen overnight. And I went through some of the hardest heartaches that I think many of us go through, but when you're going through it, it's so much different. It's something that I wouldn't even wish on my enemies, because that's how intense a heartache can be on your life. The great thing about it is blessings often are birthed out of burdens. Okay? And the thing about, like I said, being broken is that it's actually a blessing in disguise. Brokenness is not a curse. It's an opportunity to learn things that our parents didn't even teach us. It's a chance to learn some of the things that you couldn't learn when you're going through these happy times. As I said before, pain has a way of teaching you lessons that it can never be unlearned. Okay? Just, for instance, take the time that you burnt yourself on the stove. Once you realize that stove was hot, 9 times out of 10, you remember that feeling. That feeling goes into your subconscious mind, and anytime you see fire, you know to stay away. And that's the blessing that comes behind brokenness. That's the blessing that comes behind pain, is that once you feel it, and you feel it enough times, and for some of you guys are like me. I have to burn myself like 10 times, before I get it. And especially back in my 20s. I couldn't just burn myself once. I had to burn myself 15 times before I finally got it. But when I finally got it, it's like that remembrance of that pain is just something that you will never forget. It's in your subconscious mind, to where eventually your body will just not want to be affiliated with it anymore. And that's when you outgrow certain people. That's when you outgrow certain relationships. And that's when you finally come to the realization that you are more important and your well-being is more important. Like I said in my last podcast, you are going to be your biggest project that you ever work on. Okay? So at the end of the day, you are just as important as anybody else in your life. Like I said in my last podcast, hopefully you guys listen to it and then you would absolutely know what I'm talking about. But I think everything in your life happens at its divine time. I believe that you can't rush your way through lessons and you can't skip them. So although there are times in our lives where, if you're listening to this podcast and you were led to the title, you felt a sense of brokenness, or maybe you're feeling a sense of brokenness, understand that this is God appointed. And that is where you can find peace. And I know you're probably saying to yourself, why would God appoint me to a painful time? Because again, through this painful time, you will see some of your biggest blessings birthed on the other side. If you don't faint, if you don't lose faith, and you don't give up on yourself. See, once you finally get to the point of breakthrough, you'll see that the heartache and pain is all worth it. Looking over those 7 years, oh my gosh, it was so much pain, but it was all worth it. And to know that I would be where I am today, I would do it all over again. Just to get to the same place I am today, with loving myself, feeling a sense of wholeness, not feeling like I need to rely on somebody else to make me whole. And that's the great thing that pain can teach you and brokenness can teach you. Remember that self-care is not always taught.